In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the Six-Day War in 1967. Although Israel was surrounded in its past, and much today, by hostile neighbors, it's been able to defend itself due to a superior military and a society trained for war. After this lecture, you'll understand how Israel defends itself militarily and why this defense strategy complicates relationships between Israel and its neighbors. First, let's look at some stats about Israel's history of military victory. Today, Israel only has 7 million citizens and is surrounded by 300 million Muslims, many of whom do not acknowledge the existence of an Israeli state. Despite this fact, Israel has won 4 full-scale wars against the united military might of several Arab countries since gaining independence in 1948. The most impressive of these conflicts was the Six-Day War of 1967, during which Israel defeated Syria, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon in less than a week. The result was that it tripled its land holdings in the process. The question is, how has Israel managed such military success? Why, proportionally, can a country of only 7 million people defeat its neighbors whose total population is 20 or 30 times larger, and many of whom sit on vast oil reserves, and one could assume could funnel a lot of this money into building up a strong military to be able to take out Israel, which is really only the size of New Jersey? Well, the reason is because in terms of military strength, you can think of Israel as a Suzuki motorcycle, in the sense that it has an extremely high power-to-weight ratio. Before we get into some of the details of the Six-Day War, I think it's worth commenting on the military culture of Israel, which is probably one of the most militarized societies in the world. By that I mean that your average citizenry proportionally is trained for war. They have an enormous reserve base that they can call upon quickly in case an armed conflict comes up. Israeli soldiers are among the most battle-trained in the world. From age 18, Israeli men are conscripted into the Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF. They typically serve 3 years, and women serve 2 to 3 years. Once this period is finished, that it isn't over, individuals remain on reserve duty until their 40s and serve a few weeks a year. These soldiers are very well trained and proficient in a number of skills, one of which is well known if you're into martial arts, is Krav Maga, one of the world's most brutal forms of martial arts. I think Krav Maga serves as a good analogy of a lot of the defense tactics and military tactics. Unlike other forms of martial arts like Tai Chi or Kung Fu, it's not connected to a philosophical system. Rather, it's only based on proficiency. So you might learn a move to disable an attacker's knees, and right after that learn how to break somebody's neck. So completely based on pragmatism, and which is a good analogy for a lot of the very efficient military structure in Israel. The IDF maintains nearly 170,000 active troops and 400,000 reservists. Here's a couple of other facts about it. Israel also has one of the highest defense budget to GDP ratio in the world, spending nearly $2,300 a person. A healthy proportion of this money comes from U.S. foreign aid, worth approximately $3 billion a year, a number that hasn't escaped the attention of many Muslims in the Middle East. So, with such a well-trained force, it's not a big surprise that Israel handily won the Six-Day War. Let's discuss some of the events that led up to this, and this is only a very brief overview. What happened is, in the run-up to this event, there were PLO sabotage attacks on Israeli targets, and Israel raided Jordan-controlled West Bank at this time. But the event that really instigated the Six-Day War, the casus belli, or the cause for war, was in May 22nd, 1967, the Egyptian president Gamal Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. This was a breach of many international treaties. This was also an international waterway, and Israel had previously said this would be a cause for war. But in response, Nasser had UN troops removed from the Sinai Peninsula, and 5 days later, he said that Egypt's objective was the destruction of Israel. There are accounts of what it was like in Israel in the weeks immediately preceding the Six-Day War, and some people who are still alive today describe a sense of dread that was in the air, with pronouncements from Nasser that Israel would be wiped off the map, coming out in the media, and seeing troop deployments of Egyptians and Jordanian troops who had signed a military accord lining up on Israel's border. There were worries that maybe in the next month there wouldn't be anyone who had survived the attack. So what happened was Egypt, Iran, and Jordan deployed troops to Israel's border. So what Israel did was conduct a preemptive strike on its border, on the Jordanian border. Over the next 5 days, it waged a highly successful land war and also an air war. The total number of Israeli soldiers who died was less than 1,000, whereas on the other side, amongst Egyptians, Jordanians, Iraqis, and others, was over 10,000. There's many reasons for this, and this connects back to what we talked about in the previous lecture, that following Israel's independence, the Arab states who were fighting against it were very poorly coordinated with one another. But beyond poor coordination, another fact is that military strategists have talked about the military culture in many Middle Eastern states, aside from Israel, isn't well developed. Part of the reason is what we talked about in the fallout of World War I with the creation of the Middle East. How many of these states cobbled together different factions and ethnic groups and tribes that didn't feel unified? Well, these problems extend outward up into the military structure, where a military is, of course, a national unit, but trying to unite these different groups and different factions, tribes, ethnic groups, and religions that might not feel strong loyalty to one another creates major problems. Now, in the combat unit level, Middle Eastern militaries are very effective, pound for pound, just as good as the Israeli military. But if you get up to the battalion level, then problems start to emerge. Coordination is worse. Whereas with the Israeli military, there is a very strong sense of unified identity. So this is one of the reasons that military analysts have talked about of the overall effectiveness of the Israeli military. And this is something that you see in the Six-Day War with Israel's excellent effectiveness, whereas with its enemies, the coordination is much worse. Okay, so what are the consequences of the Six-Day War? Well, partially, let me go back to the previous slide and show you that map. That's the Sinai Peninsula that you see right there. What happened was, with the conclusion of the Six-Day War, Israel gained the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and all of the Sinai Peninsula. What it did was effectively triple its land holdings. It would be as if California only existed of its northern part, from the northern border to Sacramento, and then captured everything south of it down to the Mexican border. The amount of land that it gained proportionally was larger than what America gained in the Louisiana Purchase. Also, the Sinai Peninsula has significant oil holdings, so one could imagine that this made relations between Israel and Egypt much poorer. Egypt was already threatening to destroy it. Now it had taken an important piece of land. However, Israel doesn't hold on to this very long because it gives back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in the 1978 peace accords. So there are a couple of unforeseen consequences with the victory of the Six-Day War. One is that the Palestinian enclaves of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which previously belonged to Jordan and Egypt, respectively, now belong to Israel, and it remains in their hands to this day. Now that these enclaves were not controlled by Muslim states, in one sense, unfortunately for the Palestinians, they became a propaganda tool for a lot of the Middle East, where many Middle Eastern leaders, in fits of saber rattling, could blame Israel for the plight of Palestinians without worrying about it because they weren't actually having to administer for them or provide for them. So this weaponizes a lot of the debate, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And with Israel in charge of these land holdings, this is where it really becomes an international issue and one of the most problematic diplomatic issues, even to this day, even though it's over, like I said earlier, a state that's only the size of New Jersey and over only a few million people. There are many other landless people in the world with much higher populations. Kurdish people are an ethnic group in Iraq, Turkey, and Iran, and Syria that number tens of millions, and they're also landless. And they have encountered levels of persecution and unequal access to rights in their respective countries, but it's not the same diplomatic issue and not the same international controversy as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So what we're going to see in the next lecture is the rise of political Islam that happens concurrent with these issues. Thanks for listening.